Hi everyone, welcome back to Casual Watch Review channel. Well, this week I've got another interview for us. I'd really like to introduce Devon from Timestop. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sam.
There's been a lot of buzz about Henry Cavill being the new face of Longines, but I've got a suspicion that he probably would wear one of your watches more than he would wear a Longines. So we've got to talk about this great digital watch that you've invented and why you did. So this is the Timestop D-20, and it's a dice rolling watch for gaming.
Yeah, that's exactly right. First of all, I've been into watches for a long time. My first digital watches, like, I don't know, many folks of my age, was a Timex Iron Man. It was just sort of what I grew up with. Then later in life, got into mechanical watches, Seikos, and things like that. And then really the story with this watch started during the pandemic. So during that time, I was running a makerspace here in Pittsburgh, where I'm located, and then doing Dungeons and Dragons that I got into with some friends of mine, and working on some electronics projects with my kiddos. And as I was doing this, of course, with my background interest in watches, something that struck me as strange was that there hadn't been a watch that had a sort of a virtual dice rolling functionality. So I don't know how much into the history of Dungeons and Dragons you are, but it first came out in 1974. Important to watchmaking was the Casio Casiotron, which was the first watch to use an LCD display. Also came out in 1974. The game of Dungeons and Dragons and the technology of digital watches both sort of grew up together in the late 70s and then the 80s and early into the 90s. And so when I was chatting with my D&D group about it, who were also many of them makers, we were kind of surprised that this didn't exist. And that sort of started a multi-year journey to get much more into electronics than I had been before, ultimately reaching out to some specialists in both electrical engineering, firmware, programming, and things like that to bring the D20 to life.
I could tell straight away when I received the watch. You kindly sent me two in, so all the footage here is of the two models that you've got here. I could tell that you were into watches because the case design it seems like a love letter to Casio. It's almost a homage to the vintage Casios, but very modern as well, especially this metal one, which I think is my favorite. I hadn't realized that before, that there hadn't been a dice rolling watch. You do see high-end watches that have a roulette wheel, but that's more of a gimmick. So, I mean, that must have been quite interesting to find that out.
It is a love letter to digital watches. And I think, if you look back into the history, really, for a long time it was the Japanese watch brands that were really pushing the envelope in terms of digital, technology. Certainly Casio, right? And they've stuck with it the longest. If you look back at some of their watches, some of my favorites are things like their Cosmo Phase. If you're familiar with that one, that's loved by folks. It has a little solar system. Some melody watches that would play, different songs at different times of the year. Got into some really interesting sort of digital complications, late 80s, early 90s. But also into brands like Seiko, other Japanese brands, got into digital watches. So, the well-known Casio Royale, as they say these days, that was modeled after a stainless steel Seiko sports watch, that was used famously in a Bond movie. And so a lot of it was a love letter to digital watches, and we took inspiration from that. Part of the inspiration for our brand name, that there's sort of two. One is Timestop is a D&D spell that stops time for everyone but you, but it's also an homage to what I consider these sort of evergreen technologies, things that still, as newer and different technologies are developed, still have a lot going for them. And one of the things that LCD displays, segmented liquid crystal displays, have going for them is an extremely long battery life. What I think is really interesting is digital watches as a sort of pop culture got more attention when they were the newest and the brightest thing. But our watch has a 3-year battery life at least. And that's pretty common to be able to reach with a liquid crystal display, even with some of these complications. Whereas you're looking at something with a graphical display, you're in days, weeks, maybe a month. So, we really like the amount of battery life that you can get for a watch, because after all, watches most of their time are just telling the time, and only once in a while are performing some of these functions, that one might find in an app or something like that on a smartwatch. But then, we like segmented liquid crystal displays in their own right. Each of those segments acts electronically as a little capacitor, and is made with very similar production techniques to the printed circuit boards that sort of drive the display. And so it's sort of it's the display that a printed circuit board sort of wants to have, sort of a sister technology. And so we like it insofar as watches are little showcases of different kinds of technologies, right? Whether it's mechanical and seeing all the wonderful things that you can do with these, mechanical complications or digital. We think that there's just a really great pairing between the liquid crystal display and the printed, circuit board that drives it.
Yeah, so you started talking about it there, and I think this is the real genius behind this watch. Is most digital watches, they're buying sort of off the shelf movements, but you've had to literally create this. This isn't something you could just buy off the shelf from China or somewhere, I'm guessing.
Both because of what we wanted the watch to do in terms of the complication, as well as some of our own interests as designers and makers and engineers, is we really sort of built this from the ground up. So one of the reasons that, so many, watchmakers, whether they're, large and established or newer, have watches with sort of a relatively limited set of functions, is that the brains of their watches, the modules that they're using, are made where all of the circuits are sort of on that circuit board itself, and they're sort of hard coded in there. There are actually some modders who, if you open up some Casio watches, you can add functionality to your Casio watch by soldering together some jumpers in there. It's because they make millions of these circuit boards, and it's really sort of linking or unlinking certain circuits that controls what functionality that those have. And since we wanted this novel functionality, we didn't really have that option. So we went with an extremely low power, what's called a microcontroller, as the brains, and sort of built our module around there, programming that from the ground up, from 0 lines of code to all of the things that it does, from creating our own electronics to the injection molded sections of the module itself. We sort of really built everything from the ground up. So it was extremely gratifying to be able to do that, and it also gave us a lot of autonomy over what we wanted the watch to do, how we wanted it to function. In terms of speaking of love letters to digital watches, a lot of things that fans of digital watches bemoan are things like price points for all metal cases that have their reasons, particularly with designs of some of the larger brands. Limited viewing angles for the LCD display. So we went with what's called an STM, a super twisted pneumatic display that like Casio uses, but on some of their higher end G-Shocks and things like that. We went with mechanical buttons, so whenever you click a button, it's a nice sort of a tactile click instead of, what I would bemoan as sort of a squishy feel of a lot of digital watches. Premium case materials, whether it's the stainless steel or even the resin watches that we have, are made of what's called PBT, which is a plastic that's really loved by mechanical keyboard enthusiasts, because it wears better than ABS and some of those typical materials.
The viewing angle on this is great. I've been reviewing a few digital watches from the main brands recently, and I'm surprised that sometimes the viewing angle technology seems to have gone backwards instead of forwards on some of them, which is I find quite interesting. So we've talked about the D&D, the dices for that game, but it can cover multiple games and multiple different die types, I should say. So it's not just for sort of tabletop gaming either.
Yeah. So I guess for viewers, the general functionality of the watch is, in addition to the telling day, date, time, we have what's called a quick roll mode, and you can select from the common what are called polyhedral dice. So a 4-sided dice up to a 20-sided dice. While your watch is in its regular mode, you can click that roll button and generate a virtual outcome, whether it's a 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, or 20-sided dice. We also have what's called advanced combat mode, where you can actually roll multiple dice at once, as well as a D100. And so things like the D100 are, useful in various games. We've actually had some folks who play Warhammer, where they'll be rolling a lot of D6s once, and you can use it for that. But then, we also have folks who use it, for any game that requires dice, whether it's, single or multiple, and even for, other things. So a lot of folks that might not even play tabletop games, will enjoy it. They'll make their daily decisions with it, right? So, you're rolling a D20, 11 or higher, and you go to this restaurant. 10 or below, you go to a different one. When you were talking about the joy of some of these early digital watches, it's that they had simple functions, but they had something fun.
I've got to ask you the question because people, I'm sure, are going to comment it. Is how every time the dice is rolled in a random sequence? What is the program? Is it like a slot machine or something along those lines? Or
yeah, so that's a great question. We have gotten that question, and particularly folks in computer science or programming ask these questions, because true random numbers are a very deep rabbit hole to go down. This is an 8-bit processor that we're using, so it's relatively, simple. And we also knew that we weren't trying to make, sort of cryptographically random numbers, that would be used for highly secure operations. So we thought about two things. One was randomness, and sort of being like, how hard would it be to predict the next roll? But we also really focused on fairness, right? So you want, when you roll a dice, to get as many on a D20, you want it to get a D1 as many times as a D20, right? Like, that's probably for dice rolling, and for the application of this watch, it was kind of more important to have it be fair, to get a normal distribution of the outcomes. And so the way that works is the watch is programmed in C, the programming language C. It has a pseudo-random function there. So it's not truly random. It is something that you're not, the person you're playing Dungeons and Dragons with isn't going to be able to know what their next roll is. It's as random as that is. But what you do with these systems is you add what's called some entropy, some sort of random seed that you start with. And so we use the first time when you click the roll button, sort of ever. That's very hard to replicate, as well as an internal temperature sensor. So you wouldn't want to, I don't know, base your Bitcoin wallet or something like that, off of this watch. But it will have a fair distribution for when you're playing games. And so that's sort of what we focused on.
Yeah, and I like, even on the especially on the D20 mode, with if you'd roll a 1 or a 20, you've either got the broken sword or the sort of the power sword for the critical damage. I think that's a nice little feature as well. That
was sort of the idea with this watch was, we wanted something that wasn't like over the top gimmicky. You could wear as sort of a daily watch, and in most contexts, it just sort of looks like a digital watch, but had these sort of, Easter eggs, these little things that were fun and that you would know was kind of fun. You could, if you're really into Dungeons and Dragons, think about your character in your latest campaign while you're at the office, and if you're not, just enjoy having a fun little quirk that isn't over the top, but that makes it interesting.
It does look on the face of it like an everyday watch. It's got obviously the time, the date. You've got a light on there as well. Light on the wrist, comfortable 20mm lug width that you could swap another strap out onto as well. I've been wearing it quite a bit as well. It's just a really cool little digital watch. So you could tell like a lot of thought went into the design as well. So how many prototypes was there before you came to this design?
Oh gosh, yeah. So would you like a little show and tell?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Sure. So the one thing that I was thinking of as you were interviewing the other company that recently made a digital watch is we sort of started with the electronics, and since we were building that from the ground up. So often when you're starting an electronic project, you start with what's called a breadboard. And so that's something like, let's see if I can get it in there. So something like that. So, these are all, the components that ended up in the final watch, but in a much larger format. And you can sort of plug in the different wires and set it up. So really, in terms of prototypes, this was our first prototype. So this is a stock LCD display. So we didn't have, the interesting, characters and symbols that we have, but we were able to sort of, get time working, stuff like that. And then we got in our custom LCD, and wanted to start making some of the components that would be using the final watch, but without having to make everything sort of sub-millimeter perfect. Which is what you need in a watch to sort of have everything, look the right way. And so this was prototype number 2. So this has a spot for a battery. It has the custom LCD in there, and a lot of the the final components that we would use, but just in sort of a larger form factor. And this is the way that we would plug it into the computer to do programming and troubleshooting, stuff like that. Then we started to make sort of the surround for the module. The plastic parts that would hold it all together, get it closer to the final form function or form factor, and that was this guy. The next version that was almost there, and then with the final version, is 3D printed case, getting more of the final components, and this, on the screen is going to look a lot like our finished black watch, but these are 3D printed parts. Some are laser cut. Stuff like that. Yeah, so it went through sort of a half a dozen different, generations to get to the final watch. And then wanting to make sure that this, worked. I had it on my wrist for, about half a year before anything sort of, went out into the wild, making sure we could, identify issues that there were and then correct as needed through production.
Have you had people play full D&D games just using the watch?
We do have users, myself included, who use this for full campaigns. So I still meet with that group that I started meeting with during the pandemic, 4 years later, and I play D&D with it. And about the majority of our table does as well. They also have the watch and play with it. We took that into consideration a lot in terms of the design, trying to make it relatively fast to go between the different contexts in which you would want to, create different, die rolls. But then, we also have users who use it, who will do it at D&D, events. And of course, there are our dice traditionalists who will, scoff at it. I think the way to enjoy it is not that this is not the end of physical dice. It's not meant to be that thing. It's meant to have enough functionality where you can use it for campaigns, but also it's a really good way to sort of take the game with you, right? And have that little reminder of a thing that you're interested in, just like diving watches, right? How many people who are actually diving use diving watches versus dive computers, which are much more, sophisticated, versus, having that thing on your wrist and having it remind you of, the quality that went into it, maybe an activity that you enjoy. And that's what we really, aimed for.
So let's talk about pricing now, and then perhaps talk about if you've got anything sort of planned for the future. But let's talk about the pricing to start with. So you've got two different price points for the composite, the resin case, and then the metal case.
Part of what we wanted to do was the watch started as a metal cased watch because we really like watches. We like digital watches. We wanted something that was made out of premium materials. So it's a metal case. Mineral crystal. So the metal version is it's $159, and then the resin one is $99. So we wanted things that would allow us to sort of make what we thought was a premium digital watch, but still be accessible. And not go too far into the very deep land of expensive watches.
And have you got anything planned for the future, or are you just concentrating on this at the moment?
We are definitely planning more things for the future. A lot of what folks can expect to see from us are sort of novel, interesting complications in the watch, because we sort of do build them from the ground up. Without saying too much, the next version that we're working on will be space themed. There have been some interesting space themed watches from the past that we want to sort of add some new functionality to. The thing that we're really excited about is the opportunity to add some of these fun complications to digital watches in a way in which we really haven't seen anyone else do for a long time.
The link is in the description down below if you want to check this watch out. Devin, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sam.
Guys, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Casual Watch Reviews. Thanks, guys. Bye.